I think you're going to find this reading interesting. It's called The Five Faces of Oppression. It was written by Dr. Iris Young, who is a very well-known political theorist and socialist feminist who was a professor of political science at the University of Chicago. And she also was associated with the Center for Gender Studies at the university, as well as the Human Rights Program at the university. So she really focused on political theory, feminist social theory, and analysis of public policy. And this, her Five Faces of Oppression, which this reading is based on, is one of her most well-known and widely disseminated ideas, focusing on a group theory of oppression. Now, Dr. Young, unfortunately, died quite young. She was only 57 when she died from esophageal cancer, or cancer of the throat. Um, and when you read about her, that she was really, really, really admired, not just for her work, but that she was a very, very friendly person. She always took a lot of interest in her student. She was always there for them. Now, not surprisingly, since it is included in the title of this reading, it's focused on how to understand oppression, and that oppression is not singular in nature. With this in mind, it states that a socially just society is not one which responds to oppression and social justice appropriately. It's one that also attempts to disable oppression. A socially just society would be proactive, not just reactive. And likewise, when somebody is subject to injustice, that occurs because of two processes: oppression and domination, and each of these have different forms. Of course, there is oppression based on class, but there's also racial oppression, sexual oppression, ageist oppression, etc. And all of them are equally deserving of consideration. So what Dr. Young does in this reading is to take a closer look at 5 kinds of oppression. The first is exploitation. And when I hear just the term exploitation, I automatically think of Karl Marx, since he focused on it so extensively, although he stayed almost entirely concentrated on class and how there is a power differential between employers and workers who are forced to sell their labor power to them for less than the full value of the commodities they produce with their labor. This absolutely continues to occur, although not recognized as clearly. In our society, a person works and they're paid for their work. That's the way things happen. And when a person does this, that means they have chosen who to work for, which also means they decide if they'll work for the wage offered or not. They make a decision. So if people have the freedom to work for who they want to, is it reasonable to say that class exploitation still occurs because there is choice involved on the part of the worker? Well, yes, and this is where exploitation theory comes in, not just in relation to class, but to explain all types of oppression. This theory of exploitation states that when exploitation occurs, it is a systematic, structural process that is continuous. Exploitation is continuous, it's stable, it's consistent, and it results in the profits of labor or work of one group, the workers, benefiting another group. And on one hand, it's a complicated process, but from another perspective, it's kind of simple. In our society, we have all of these norms and rules and regulations that govern against exploitation. But at the same time, we have all these norms and rules and regulation that also govern exploitation when it happens, whether people recognize it as that or not, and they are the basis of the power relations between these two groups. Can we take a theory of exploitation that would in the past only be applied to class and apply it to other kinds of oppression? The author emphatically says yes. Looking at the status of women, it's very clear this has been the situation for hundreds of years, as women historically had little power and were exploited because of it. Specifically, women have been exploited in terms of the benefit of their actual labor, as well as what the author refers to as their nurturing and sexual energies not being their own. Dr. Young makes a good point in this regard. Not that it's necessarily a new point, but the way she has explained it. We've heard before that sorry, I went too far. That the unpaid work women do in their home is not as equitably rewarded as that done by men outside of the home. We're all aware of that. But Dr. Young takes it a step further and says that in a home where the woman doesn't work outside of it for a wage, because she is thus dependent on her husband, being dependent on him makes it an exploitive relationship. And then Dr. Young makes another not new, but new point when she indicates that in addition to the traditional patriarchy structure that exploits the labor of women, as we are all already aware, she says a public patriarchy has emerged because of many women depending on government assistance, either instead of or in addition to being dependent on their husband. And furthermore, if we jump to paid labor, they are still concentrated in caregiving, nurturing occupations that end up enhancing the status of men, yet they are not compensated well for them. So in examining exploitation, Dr. Young says that no matter which way you look at it, women are subject to gender exploitation that benefits not themselves, but another group in society, men. Dr. Young says that we can apply theories of exploitation to race as well. If we look at race in relation to exploitation, that's pretty clear, especially in the US, in regards to Black Americans and Latinos regarding work, where it's recognized that these groups also have a higher concentration in lower wage, lower skilled jobs. Where are we? So then she moves on to marginalization. And what marginalization means is that treatment of a person or group or concept is that they are insignificant, that they are peripheral, that they're pushed to the margins. They're pushed to the side economically, socially, politically, or all of the above together. Social exclusion, social marginalization, is the social disadvantage of being pushed to the edge of society. This is what has become increasingly common. Not outright overt discrimination or exploitation, but more subtle marginalization. And marginalization can occur based on several characteristics. Older people are marginalized in that they're considered less important and overall just less than. They're not usually included in marketing and advertising, TV shows, movies, music. It's often automatically assumed that they don't have the ability anymore to follow or think the same way everybody else does. They're generally not considered as useful as somebody who is younger, and their perspectives and opinions are viewed the same way. People who are differently abled, as indicated by your buildings not automatically including accessibility features. They are generally not considered as useful as somebody without a disability. And when a group of people is marginalized, they run a high risk of being deprived in several ways. Economically, socially, politically, their education, regarding their health care. And your text notes that this is in part the basis of various forms of government assistance to try to actually alleviate deprivation caused by being marginalized in society and not having access to what others do. So we have government old age pensions and tax breaks. We have disability-related pensions and tax credits, that sort of thing. But these in themselves can create further problems because receiving this government assistance, having it in place, does not somehow provide those receiving it the same rights and freedoms enjoyed by other people. They are still marginalized. They're still considered less than. And in addition, receiving this government assistance then keeps them from being less marginalized in society and being more acknowledged. And I know some people, maybe many people, look at government assistance for somebody with a disability, for example, and what they see is what they see. Somebody being financially supported by the government. What the heck do they have to complain about? But in receiving that assistance, this means the person is then under the control of social services, under the direction and authority of government policies and regulations, which are applied arbitrarily and impersonally to everybody, regardless of any individualities. So it means losing a certain degree of power over your own life and losing in large part the ability to state what you need because somebody else is telling you what you need and what you don't by following all of the rules and regulations that are impersonally applied. So, in exchange for being dependent on government support, a person loses a great deal of autonomy and privacy, and sometimes even the basic right to make decisions for themselves. In many ways, it is somebody else who decides what they do or do not need. And this is not just a matter of money, it's a matter of being marginalized, of being pushed to the side because you're not perceived to be as vital as other groups. They would still be considered less than. Marginalization, quote, involves the deprivation of cultural, practical, and institutionalized conditions for exercising capacities in a context of recognition and interaction. So when a group is marginalized, it ends up involving two things: participation in productive activity of social cooperation and access to the means of consumption. If we move on to being powerless or powerlessness, the labor of the majority of society results in increase in the power of relatively few people. This was the whole basis of the 1% protests, the Wall Street protests that took place a few years ago. Even though our society is much more intricate now than just having lower class, middle class, higher class, as when Marxist theories of exploitation first emerged, our class structure is now much more varied. The labor of the majority of society still results in increasing the power of relatively few people. So sure, class exploitation has changed since Marx's time. The structure of exploitation is not exactly the same, but there's still a structure of exploitation. So it isn't just the owner and worker anymore. We also have professionals and non-professionals. And while professionals are not wealthy, they're still in a higher position than the non-professionals. And they're more likely to benefit from the exploitation of non-professionals. And in some ways, a professional does have the ability for at least some power, or should I say at least the illusion of power. Being a professional requires a higher education, and usually once they start working, they'll experience some kind of advancement in their job. So professionals often have some minor decision-making ability and minor authority compared to non-professionals. And in addition, professionals are much more likely to automatically experience a sense of respect from others away from their workplace. I have personally experienced this many times when Dr. Young points out that the privilege of professional respectability shows itself when somebody discovers what you do. They immediately and openly treat you differently. More than once, I've had that experience when talking with somebody I don't know and they ask me what I do. And I say, oh, well, I teach at the university where I live. Oh, really? And all of a sudden, it's almost, they immediately have more respect for me. And I openly admit, I could be a total idiot. I could be the nastiest person they've ever met. But as soon as they see that term, university professor, I am immediately viewed a different way. Yet still, very, very few people have any power at all at their place of work, including professionals. And for those that do have at least some power regarding their work, it's not direct, it's dependent on others. So maybe they get a vote in something. So for example, at department meetings for sociology and anthropology, if we're deciding on adding or deleting a course or changing the code of a course, or if we want to make a course officially okay to be substituted for another one, or if we want to cross-list a course with another department, we each get a vote. But none of us have any real power whatsoever at the university. The majority of us have no power at all in any way. We're powerless. We just do what we're told and that's it. You know, we'll joke sometimes that if they get somebody a little bit more realistic into administration, what we would do if we had the power to do it. For the majority of us, we simply do not have any decision-making capacity. We have no authority, We don't have the ability to demonstrate agency when we want to. We have no authority over anything, even including our own work. We are powerless. Now, cultural imperialism, this refers to how the dominant meanings of a society render the particular perspective of one's own group invisible. And at the same time, simultaneously, as they stereotype one group and label it the other. Whoever the dominant group is, it is their experiences and their culture that is put forth as the norm for everybody. This is similar to Marx's idea of a ruling class ideology, which says that the small and wealthy ruling upper class determine what the dominant and accepted ideologies will be in society. Feel free to call me a nerd. I totally enjoy discussing Marx's ruling class ideology with students who have never studied him before. First, because it's something I believe in 100%. And second, because it makes them think about something they believe they have a 100% perfect understanding of in a completely different way. Dr. Young refers to this as the means of interpretation, so that the ruling group controls the means of production, and they also control the culture in society, the means of interpretation. So this means then that cultural elements that are not supported by the ruling group, that do not reflect the ruling group, will not be recognized as a norm in society. It's only the dominant group's culture that is widely disseminated, and as a result, it's only their culture that becomes the norm, that becomes naturalized. It is their experiences that are thought to represent everybody's experiences. It is their perspectives and opinions that are thought to represent everybody's perspectives and opinions. And this is important. It's viewed as completely natural and normal. It isn't like the dominant group is forcing all of this on others. Remember in the country club reading, one of the aspects of female attendance at the clubs was the existence of a genteel masculine dominance, meaning that the men didn't need to be really overbearing and aggressive to maintain their power and control because it was so firmly established. It's the same kind of idea here. Because the culture of the dominant group is so broadly implemented, so widely accepted and acknowledged, it truly becomes the norm and becomes naturalized. Then when anything different is presented, it's viewed as wrong or it's viewed as less than. Good gig if you could get it. And thus any other culture becomes the other. And don't just skip by that idea of the other. Being viewed as the other necessarily means you are not viewed as being part of the whole, of the mainstream. You are different. And this has several effects. First, that if you're not part of the mainstream, you're the other, that them and their culture are in many ways invisible because they're not part of the dominant culture and their culture cannot become part of the dominant culture. And then, instead, their culture and everything it entails is considered obscure, and thus the people within it are considered inferior. And at the same time, those others are also subject to being stereotyped by the dominant culture. If you're having difficulty understanding this, keep a few specific examples in your head and that'll help. So, as an example, the text provides, poor grammar. Sorry, Mom. My mom's an English teacher. So whenever I say something that's not grammatically correct or I come up with a sentence that has poor sentence structure, in my head I always say, sorry, Faye. Okay, the text provides the example of heterosexuality or heteronormativity being the dominant culture, so that when regarding anybody who is not heterosexual, they are often presented as stereotypes. Gay people are always sleeping around. Gay men are always overly feminine and limp-wristed and flamboyant, that kind of thing. A stereotype, incorrect stereotype, by the way, which serves to further their culture and further naturalize the dominant culture. And the others largely have no control over this. It isn't like they have some input. and participate in the process. The othered group are subject to the assessment of the dominant group. And this results in a double consciousness, meaning that there is an internal conflict that oppressed groups experience because they're forced to look at themselves through the eyes of others. They're forced to consider themselves, at least in part, taking into account how others view them. The oppressed person wants to be viewed and treated the same as the person who is not oppressed. But the dominant cultures tell them, you're not the same. You're othered. And just by virtue of being an other, they have a different life. They are part of and defined by the dominant culture at the same time that they are defined by and part of their own culture, which is deemed inferior. It is othered. And that's why it's called a double consciousness. So we end up with this odd kind of thing going on. Somebody whose culture is not the dominant culture is identified in several ways as being part of an other. At the same time, although placed in that category, they and their culture are in some ways invisible. At the same time, they and their culture are recognized enough to be othered and labeled less than. And you could look at this in terms of separate ethnic cultures. This is also a huge argument in terms of just larger American culture in general taking over the world. Now, the last kind of oppression that Dr. Young focused on is violence, something we can all probably automatically think of examples for. When somebody is attacked for no other reason than the color of their skin, their religion, their gender. And I think Dr. Young is correct in pointing out that this includes not only the extreme examples of really overt, outright violence, but also things like intimidation and humiliation and ridicule, etc. She makes a good point. Violence occurs all the time in various ways and with varying degrees of severity. But violence that is oppressive is labeled that way because the social context within which the violence occurs. So let's say there's a 19-year-old guy and he's beaten up one night. He's been out with friends, and when he leaves the bar and starts walking home, it happens. That has been known to happen. What's the difference between this situation and another that indicates he is being oppressed? If this occurs because he is gay or bisexual or trans, it is not just a crime, it's a hate crime, and as such has a systemic quality to it. What I mean by that is, if not for that particular characteristic, the guy would never have been attacked. It is because he is gay or bisexual or trans or black or Asian or Jewish or whatever. And further still, it isn't just that this horrible violent act occurs. It is the person being aware of the fact that because they possess that particular characteristic, they are more likely to be considered for an attack. They know that belonging to that othered group. So women are told to walk with their keys in their hand arranged through their knuckles, to walk with their keys out so they can click the panic button on the key fob. And even if never attacked, the threat of violence, which might occur for no other reason than they are female, affects them. When this kind of oppressive violence occurs, it's often part of a social practice, which might sound kind of odd. What Dr. Young means is often when violence occurs against a member of a minority group, it's planned. I don't mean meticulously planned days in advance, but there is premeditation involved. When it occurs, it's often committed by a group of people, not just one, and it often follows certain informal norms. Think of the guy leaving the bar who is not heterosexual and he's attacked walking home. He's attacked for no other reason than his sexuality. The people who do it are aware of this characteristic and plan to attack him only because of it. They do it together, like it's a normal thing to take part in, and they consider the violence they perpetrate an appropriate response to that man because of his one characteristic. Why does this occur? And reading this in the text, I couldn't help but automatically think of all the incidents against gay men in the US that ended up gaining media attention. And with these, it was often suggested that the reason the men were attacked was because the people doing it either hated them or feared them or both. And this was always an important distinction to make because it would mean the difference between charging the perpetrator with a crime or with a hate crime. So to bring this all together, to quote Dr. Young directly, what she has tried to do is to pluralize the category of oppression. What she is saying essentially is that you don't need separate frameworks, separate systems, separate ideologies to understand the different kinds of oppression that exist. No. In fact, taking that approach will result in an incomplete assessment, an incomplete solution. Instead, using this method of studying oppression that is multi-factored, applied to all kinds of oppression, provides a much clearer picture.